back to the minimal facts argument. Jesus died by crucifixion. 2, the disciples had experiences where they believed they saw the risen Jesus. 3, these things were written about early, okay? That he died on a cross, that he rose from the dead, that he appeared to them, okay? They were written early. The 4th minimal fact is that the disciples were so transformed by what had occurred that they were willing to die for what they had seen, right? So now you have Jesus crucified on a cross, the disciples believing that they had seen the risen Lord, and that testimony was written early, and then them willing to die for whatever they actually saw. Now you may say, well, other religions, Islam and other religions, they die for what they believe. The difference with Christianity versus every other religion is the disciples were not, the followers of Jesus were not just dying for something that they believed happened. They saw it with their own eyes. Either it happened or it didn't happen. If they made it up, right? If they made up the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, they would not have died for that lie. Now, church history tells us that 11 of the 12 disciples were martyred for their beliefs. That leaves out St. John, who died on the island of Patmos. Now, you may say, we don't have the writings of 11 of the 12 disciples, so we can't, how do we know? How many sources do we actually have of the original disciples that they were willing to die for the resurrection? Well, we do have 5 sources that are in the New Testament that talk about Jesus and his resurrection. And that would be Peter, right? 1st and 2nd Peter. James, the brother of Jesus, who again we'll talk about a little later. That would be Jude, the other brother of Jesus. That would be Matthew and John. That's 5 sources that all claimed that Jesus rose from the dead, and they were actually there. They saw it with their own eyes. Now you may say, well, they died for Christianity, but they weren't necessarily dying for the resurrection. Well, Paul says that without the resurrection, you have no Christianity. Christianity is based on an historical event. If Jesus either rose from the dead or he didn't rise from the dead. If he didn't rise from the dead, our faith is futile. If he did rise from the dead, it is the greatest event in human history. This Jew who performs miracles, claims to be the Son of God. We went over that in, if you didn't see that in that video right there. And then talks about how he's going to rise from the dead, and then does rise from the dead. The greatest event in human history. So why do scholars believe that Paul received this creed in his first meeting to Jerusalem that we talked about in Galatians 1:18 versus his second meeting talked about in Galatians 2, verse 1. Remember, he says in Galatians 1:18 that he had his conversion in, say, 32, and then from there he goes to Arabia, then to Damascus, comes back 3 years later, goes to Jerusalem, meets with James and Peter, and that is where scholars believe he received it. Well, then in Galatians 2 verses 1, it says, I went up a second time. I went up again to Jerusalem. And he, at this time, he said after 14 years. So if Paul goes up the first time, say around 35 AD, and then he goes up 14 years later, that would be around 49 AD, which is still within 19 years of the resurrection. But he went up there and met up with the 3 pillars of the early Christian church at that time: James, the brother of Jesus, Cephas or Peter, and John. And it says in Galatians 2 verse 6, they added nothing to me. So here we have Paul going up, wanting to make sure he's not running his race in vain. And it says in verse 6, they added nothing to my message. Okay, so that is why scholars think that it is the first time that he went to Jerusalem and received this creed, that would be adding to his message, versus the second time where it says they added nothing to my message. And then of course they gave him, Paul and Barnabas, the right hand of fellowship, okay, and they blessed him, right? If he was speaking something different than them, something heretical, some people say, oh, well, Paul was speaking a different gospel. Well, then this verse wouldn't make any sense. This proves that the gospel that Paul was preaching was the same gospel that the early Christians were preaching. They gave him the right hand of fellowship. They blessed him, right? They wouldn't do that if he was speaking something heretical. We have our 4 minimal facts. Again, 1 is Jesus died by crucifixion. 2, that his followers had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. 3, the messengers wrote about this early. 4, that those followers were transformed by what they saw enough that they were willing to die for it. And then that brings us to 5 and 6. And 5 is that Paul, who was a persecutor of Christians, and he was dragging them out and having them put in prison and killed as well. His transformation from persecutor to disciple of the Lord has to be attested for, okay? So that is another minimal fact. Something happened in Paul's life, and it is explained in Acts chapter 9 as well as other spots, where Paul has some sort of experience that changes him from a persecutor of Christians to a servant of that same sect at that time, Christianity. And then the last one, in the same sort of way, is that James, the brother of Jesus, who lived in the same household as Jesus, did not believe in Jesus prior to the resurrection, but later, after the resurrection, and again he was mentioned as well in that creed, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, after seeing the resurrection, he becomes a follower of Jesus and becomes one of the pillars of the Christian church. Those 6 facts, again, are accepted by scholars, the majority of scholars, both liberal and conservative. And those 6 facts point to Jesus rising from the dead as the most reasonable explanation. 99% of scholars say that Jesus lived, okay? 95% say that he was crucified on a cross. So what happened to his body? We will discuss some of the alternatives to the resurrection in the next video. If you want to make educational videos like this in sometimes as little as 10 or 15 minutes, check out the Pictory link below in the description section. We'll see you in that video over there.